The most feared man in South Philadelphia put $10,000 on my serving tray and offered to buy one kiss. His friends sat watching from across the room, and one of them, a silver-haired man named Leonard Voss, was smiling like he already knew exactly how this would end. I looked at that money, more than I earned in 4 months of carrying trays, and then I looked Carmine Belloro in the eye and told him no. What I said next made the entire room go silent. Do I look so bad that even a kiss from me has to be paid for? My eyes were burning, but I would rather have swallowed glass than let those men watch me cry. Carmine's face changed in a way I didn't expect. The confidence drained out of it, and something that looked a lot like shame took its place. He pulled the money off my tray himself. "I was wrong," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "You owe me nothing, not even forgiveness." Then he stepped back and let me walk out of that dining room with my head up, past his bodyguards, past his associates, past Leonard Voss, whose smile had died somewhere between the offer and my answer. I didn't understand until weeks later that I had walked out of that room with a mystery hanging around my neck, because Voss had called me Miss Malone before anyone had spoken my name. And when Carmine first looked my way, it was Voss who had steered him toward me, saying, "Try the simple one. She looks practical." I couldn't stop asking myself, practical for what? Before I tell you how a mafia boss ended up asking for my forgiveness on a church kitchen doorstep, you should know who I am. And if stories about dignity, the kind money can't buy, matter to you, take 1 second to like and subscribe, because what happened to me that night had actually started 28 years before I was even in that room. My name is Grace Malone. I'm 33, curvy, and I coordinate catering events at a private supper club in South Philadelphia, the kind of place where the entrees cost more than my grocery budget. I grew up with very little money, raised mostly by my mother, Helen, after my father decided fatherhood was optional. She died 6 years ago, and some days I still reach for the phone to call her. My mother, Helen, was the hardest working woman I ever knew. People called her practical, usually meaning she never complained about anything. She cleaned offices at night, sewed costumes for the church pageant, and somehow never let us feel poor at the dinner table. She has been gone 6 years, and I still measure myself against her and come up short. The family I have left is my brother Sean, 39, who treats my paycheck like a shared resource and my life like a punchline. That very evening, between courses, I answered his text asking for $200. His message ended with a joke about my weight and my single life, and I laughed it off the way I always do, because jokes land softer when you tell them on yourself first. My soft spot has always been the people nobody sees, like Mr. Feld, 76, who works the club's cloakroom part-time because his pension doesn't stretch. That night I wrapped up leftover chicken and potatoes for him instead of letting the kitchen throw it away. He pretended to protest. I pretended to believe him. It was our little ceremony, and I treasured it more than I admitted. After my shift, I stopped by the church kitchen where I volunteer, and while I stirred a pot of soup meant for Saturday's lunch, I said my usual honest prayer. God, love can be difficult. Just don't send me an idiot at a discount. I wasn't desperate for romance. I had simply spent years being useful to everyone while quietly believing I was nobody's first choice. That club had been my second home for 4 years. I knew which waiter was going through a divorce, which cook hid candy for the busboys' kids, and which regular tipped in crumpled singles because it was all she had. Fancy people came and went through that dining room. The staff was the real family, and I was its oldest daughter. That Friday night, the club closed to the public for an after-hours private dinner. My manager warned me the booking was sensitive, Carmine Belloro and his senior associates. You don't live in South Philadelphia without knowing that name. Half the neighborhood feared him, the other half quietly owed him. My job was simple: Keep the food moving and stay invisible. I was good at invisible. Carmine arrived with 6 men, and the room itself seemed to straighten its posture. He was 49, controlled, expensive-looking, the kind of man whose quiet voice carried further than other people's shouting. Leonard Voss walked in at his shoulder, 61, polished, smiling at everyone and warm to no one. It was Voss who noticed me first, before Carmine ever glanced my way. "The Malone girl works the room tonight," Voss murmured to him as I poured wine. I assumed he'd read my name badge, the way guests sometimes do. It didn't occur to me that the badge showed only my first name. It didn't occur to me that he had picked me out, the way a man picks a card he'd already palmed. I just kept pouring and smiling. The trouble started with philosophy, the way it often does when powerful men get bored after dinner. Voss began needling Carmine about loyalty, claiming money couldn't buy the genuine kind. Then he narrowed it into something petty and personal. "Any struggling worker will sell a little affection if the number is high enough," he said. "Everyone has a price, even the sweet ones." Carmine disagreed, and his pride did the rest. I watched a 49-year-old man who controlled half the city get baited like a teenager at a county fair. "Name the test," he said. And Voss, smiling that knowing smile, looked directly across the room at me. "Try the simple one," he said. "She looks practical." That word landed on me strangely, though I couldn't have told you why yet. I want you to imagine that moment from where I stood. A room full of men in expensive suits, watching a catering coordinator with sauce on her apron become the evening's entertainment. Carmine crossed the floor with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no, and the whole table turned to enjoy the show. Every childhood insecurity I owned came along to watch. He was almost charming at first. I'll give him that. He asked my name as if he didn't know, complimented the service, let me believe for about 90 seconds that a man like him might simply be flirting with a woman like me. Then he said, "What would one kiss cost?" casual as asking the time, and set the folded money on my tray. People ask me now whether I hesitated. $10,000 would have paid off Sean's latest disaster and my dentist bill in the same afternoon. But something in my chest went cold and clear, and I understood with my whole body that I was not a woman to him. I was a demonstration. I pushed the money back across the tray. "Do I look so bad that even a kiss from me has to be paid for?" The words came out quieter than I intended, and somehow that made them heavier. Carmine held my gaze, and I watched understanding arrive in his face like a late train. He took the money back. He apologized. And then he did the thing I least expected. He let me leave. In the locker room, my hands finally shook. I untied my apron and cried for exactly 4 minutes, because that's all the time I allowed myself. On the bus home, I kept hearing that word, practical, simple, like I was a transaction waiting for the right number. I told myself I'd never see Carmine Belloro again. South Philadelphia had other plans for me. He found me the next afternoon, outside the church kitchen, leaning against the brick wall like a man unsure he had the right to be there. "No flowers, no jewelry, no envelope," he said. "I owe you one honest apology, so here it is. I was wrong, and you didn't deserve it." Then he stopped talking, as if he had budgeted his words and refused to overspend. "An apology doesn't mean I want you around," I told him. He nodded once. "Then I won't be." And he left. Actually left, without negotiating, which was the first thing he'd done that contradicted everything I believed about powerful men. I watched him walk down the block past the shuttered hardware store, and I hated that a small part of me noticed how well he took rejection. I learned over the next weeks that distance from Carmine Belloro was not entirely mine to grant, because our worlds overlapped without either of us arranging it. He had business tied to properties all over the neighborhood. His name was behind the club, the parish hall rental, even the building where my church held its suppers. Our paths crossed the way trolley tracks cross streets, by design, not pursuit. So I watched him, the way you watch weather you don't trust yet. At a neighborhood fundraiser, I saw him sit with two elderly residents long after the other donors drifted away, listening to a story about the war that I happened to know took 40 minutes to tell. He never once looked at his watch. Powerful men perform patience for cameras. There were no cameras. At the club, I watched him thank the dishwashers by name. When Mr. Feld's knee buckled carrying coats, Carmine pulled out a chair for him so naturally that Mr. Feld accepted it before remembering to be intimidated. Later, Carmine asked me, very casually, whether Mr. Feld's knee did better on dry days. He remembered tiny things. I noticed, and I didn't like it. One rainy Thursday, a young waiter dropped a full tray of wine glasses near Carmine's table, and the whole room froze, waiting for the famous temper. Carmine picked up the biggest shard himself, told the boy that his own grandfather had broken more dishes than the kid would ever carry, and slipped him $20 for his dry cleaning. The waiter looked like he had witnessed a miracle. He never once punished me for keeping my distance. No sulking, no sudden appearances at my table, no flowers I could refuse. He simply behaved, week after week, like a man serving a sentence he had sentenced himself to. My anger didn't vanish. It downshifted into something guarded and curious, which is a far more dangerous emotion, because curiosity makes you look, and looking makes you see. Our first real conversation happened over a broken coffee urn at a parish hall event. The thing was hissing like an angry cat, the volunteers were panicking, and Carmine rolled up sleeves that cost more than my couch and fixed the valve with a butter knife. "My father was a mechanic," he said, catching me staring. "Some things you don't outgrow." It was the first ordinary fact he ever handed me. The ordinary dinner, our first voluntary one, happened after 6 weeks of these crossings, he asked. I said I'd pick the place, expecting to test him with my favorite red sauce joint with the wobbly chairs. Instead, I panicked and picked somewhere nice, then spent the meal studying a menu with prices like ransom demands. At these prices, I told him, the portion should at least be legally considered an adult. He laughed, really laughed, head back, the sound bouncing off the white tablecloths, while nearby diners stared at the famous Carmine Belloro, losing his composure over a catering coordinator's joke. Then he did something better. When the waiter came, he remembered what I'd actually enjoyed at the club, the simple things, the lemon chicken, the bitter greens, and asked if I wanted to order for myself. He paid attention without trying to impress me. Halfway through dinner, he said, "You joke when you're uncomfortable. I've been tracking it for weeks. Nobody, not Sean, not any man I'd dated, had ever bothered to learn my tells. I joked anyway, because old habits own real estate. But that night on my front steps, when he simply said good night and meant it, I stood there a long time after his car turned the corner. That night, lying awake, I argued with myself. He had apologized once and meant it. He had never pushed, never hovered, never made me regret refusing him. But a woman like me learns early that attention from a powerful man usually arrives with a bill attached. So I decided to enjoy one dinner and expect nothing. Expecting nothing had always been my safest religion. It was around then that the past reached up and tapped my shoulder. I was prepping the club for an anniversary event when I stopped, as I sometimes did, in front of the old staff photographs in the service hallway. One black and white picture from decades back showed the waitstaff lined up by the kitchen doors, and one waitress, third from the left, had my face. Not similar. Mine. I stood there until my arms prickled. The woman was a little younger than me, hair pinned up, that same wide-set expression my mother had in every photo of her youth. The brass nameplate beneath the frame was missing, just 4 empty screw holes where identification used to be. I found Mr. Feld in the cloakroom and asked him, as lightly as I could manage, who she was. Mr. Feld looked at the photograph, and something went through his face that I can only describe as a door closing. "Old staff come and go, Gracie," he said, polishing a glass that was already clean. "Hard to remember everyone." Mr. Feld remembered everything. He remembered guests' coats from single visits years apart. He was lying, and we both knew it, and that frightened me more than the resemblance. Then Leonard Voss came around the corner, and I watched Mr. Feld's whole body change. He set down the glass, wished me a good evening in a voice I'd never heard him use, and walked away from me mid-sentence. Voss watched him go, then turned to me with that polished smile. "Admiring the history, Miss Malone." Again, my name, unprompted, like a calling card he enjoyed leaving. That night I called Sean, mostly because he was the only other person alive who knew our mother's young years. "Did Mom ever work at the club?" I asked. The line went quiet in a way silence shouldn't. Then Sean's voice came back, harder than my question deserved. "Leave those old club stories alone. Not, I don't know. Not, why are you asking? Just, leave it alone." I didn't press Sean. I went back to Mr. Feld instead, privately, after a Tuesday shift, with 2 cups of the tea he liked, and no audience. "I'm not asking for gossip," I told him. "I'd rather hear an uncomfortable truth about my mother than spend the rest of my life wondering why a photograph of her makes you afraid." His hands went still around the cup. He told me Helen had worked at the club 28 years earlier, when she was about my age. He'd been in a senior service role then, and he remembered her the way you remember certain people, because of a single moment that showed you exactly who they were. "Your mother," he said, "was the only person I ever saw refuse money she needed, from a man nobody refused." A wealthy young regular had taken an interest in her, Mr. Feld said, polished, patient, the kind who mistakes persistence for romance. One night, in front of several employees, he offered her money for her affection, confident that a struggling waitress was simply a negotiation that hadn't found its number yet. Helen looked at him and said no, calmly, the way you'd refuse an extra fork. He called her practical, Mr. Feld said. Before it happened, after it happened. Like the word explained her. "She'll be practical about this. Every Malone is practical." He looked at me over his glasses. "That young man grew up, Gracie. He's older now, but he's still at that club." He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. I felt the floor of my whole life tilt. Leonard Voss, my mother's humiliation, 28 years old, sitting at Carmine's right hand and calling me Miss Malone, like an inheritance he'd claimed. I suddenly understood that the dare hadn't been about me at all. I'd been cast in a remake of a scene from before I was born. But one thing didn't fit. How did Voss know my schedule, my money troubles, my sore spots? Before I tell you what I found out, I want to ask you something, and I'd truly like your answer in the comments. If you learned someone had been feeding a stranger your private weaknesses, your money problems, your insecurities, your worst nights, and that someone was your own family, would you confront them, or would you protect yourself quietly and never give them the chance again? I chose confrontation, because I was raised by Helen Malone, and silence had never once protected me. But I didn't go to Sean with accusations. I went to his apartment with his favorite takeout, sat on his sagging couch, and said, "Tell me what Leonard Voss wanted with me." I watched my brother, who could lie to landlords, girlfriends, and priests without blinking, drop his fork. He mocked me first, because mockery was his native language. Then I said Voss's name again, and mentioned the word practical, and something in Sean crumbled like wet cardboard. His debts had gotten serious, he admitted. Months ago, Voss had offered him cash, real cash, for information about me. Not secrets, Sean insisted quickly. Just details, just facts, just me, sold by the pound. "What did you tell him?" My voice didn't sound like mine. Everything, it turned out. Where I worked, which nights I'd be on the floor, how strained my money was, that I was single. What insecurities hurt me most? My weight, my age, the fear that people only kept me around because I was useful. My own brother had itemized my softest places and invoiced a stranger for them. "I thought he wanted to embarrass you," Sean said, as if that made it smaller. "Rattle you." "I didn't think." "You didn't think," I said, because thinking wasn't in the price. I walked out while he was still explaining. I did not drive to Carmine. I did not collapse into anyone's arms. I went home alone and grieved, privately, for a family loyalty I discovered I'd been carrying by myself. The strange thing about betrayal is how it resorts your memories. Every time Sean had joked about my weight, every loan, every eye roll at my little catering job, I'd filed them as ordinary brotherly cruelty. Now they reassembled into something worse, a man who had been measuring my value in dollars long before Voss paid him for the appraisal. I cried until 2 in the morning. Then I got up and made a decision. Carmine, it turned out, had been doing his own arithmetic. He came to me the following evening, at the church kitchen, where I apparently could not be escaped, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept. "Voss steered me to you," he said without preamble. "I've replayed that night 100 times. He chose you before I ever saw you. I need to know why, and so do you." So I told him about the photograph, about Mr. Feld, about Helen and the word practical, about Sean. Watching Carmine Belloro absorb the news that he'd been used as a prop in someone else's 28-year grudge was like watching a storm decide where to land. He was very quiet. Then he said the thing that explained everything. He asked me afterward whether you'd taken the money. He was disappointed. We laid the whole scheme out between us like a terrible jigsaw. Voss had recognized me, my surname, my face, my mother's ghost, during earlier club events. The old humiliation had never stopped itching. Once Sean sold him my weaknesses and schedule, Voss built the dare deliberately, to recreate Helen's rejection with a different ending. He used Carmine's wealth and reputation to make the experiment convincing. The real target was never the kiss. It was a dead woman. Voss wanted to prove, through me, his lifelong belief that every Malone has a price, that dignity is just a number nobody's reached yet. He wanted to beat my mother 28 years after she'd beaten him. And instead, without knowing anything about her story, I had stood in that dining room and made her exact same choice. I sat with that for a long moment. You have to understand, I had spent my whole life feeling like the lesser Malone. The plain one, the broke one, the disappointment who'd never become half of what Helen was. And it turned out that when my character was tested in exactly the way hers had been, I hadn't fallen short of my mother. I had been carrying her strength the entire time without knowing it. Carmine watched me while this rearranged me. "What he did to you started with what he did to me," I said finally. "But how it ends is my say, not yours. So here are my conditions. My mother's story stays private. She didn't spend her dignity to have it retold as clubhouse entertainment. And nobody gets hurt for my sake. Not a hand on him. If you can't do that, you don't do anything." A month earlier, I would never have dared speak to Carmine Belloro in conditions. But I wasn't the woman from that dining room anymore. Or rather, I finally knew I'd never been her. He listened without a flicker of argument. "Agreed," he said. "Both of them. But understand something, Grace. What he did wasn't only against you. He used my name, my table, my house. That part is mine to answer." On Sunday morning, I visited Helen's grave and sat on the cold grass longer than I had planned. I told her about the photograph, about Voss, about the $10,000 I had pushed back across a tray without even knowing her story. The wind moved through the cemetery trees, and I could almost hear her laughing with recognition. Like mother, like daughter, whether I had known it or not. The Belloro Council met on a Thursday, and I only know what Carmine told me afterward. Told, not reported, because I'd asked to hear it myself. Voss walked in relaxed, Carmine said. The way a man walks when he believes the meeting is about someone else. He smiled. He assumed this was an embarrassing romantic problem that would be smoothed over with a slap on the wrist. Carmine let him sit. Then he laid out, date by date, what Voss had done. Not the insult to me, not my mother, nothing that was mine to own. He spoke only about what belonged to that room. A trusted associate had manipulated the head of the family, converted Beloro authority into a tool for a private grudge, and made the organization an instrument in humiliating an innocent woman. You didn't lie to a rival, Carmine told him. You lied through me. The room full of senior men understood the difference instantly, Carmine said, and so did Voss, whose polish finally cracked. He tried to frame it as a joke gone wrong, a wager among friends. Carmine asked him how many friends buy information from a woman's own brother. Nobody at that table laughed. There was no shouting, no threats, no violence. I had his word, and he kept it. What happened instead was colder and, for a man like Voss, far worse. Carmine removed him from everything that had made him matter: the council seat, the private access, the Beloro-backed business arrangements, the club privileges, the right to ever again use Carmine's name as if it were his own. Voss tried one last argument, and it was the one that told me everything about him. She's made you weak, he said. A catering girl, and you're dismantling 30 years of loyalty. Carmine told me he almost smiled at that, because he finally understood the irony. I hadn't caused any weakness. His own ego had. All I'd done was refuse to be purchased, which only looks like weakness to a man who's never owned anything he didn't buy. Leonard Voss walked out of that club through the service corridor, the same corridor where, 28 years earlier, a young waitress named Helen Malone had walked away from him with her dignity intact. This time, no one followed him. No one called his name. He had spent nearly 3 decades believing everyone had a price, and in the end, the only thing ever purchased in that story was him, by his own bitterness. A few of the men at that table knew pieces of the old story, Carmine said, and not one of them offered Voss a ride home. Status had been his whole identity, and he'd borrowed all of it. I didn't celebrate when Carmine finished telling me. I thought about a man who'd let one refusal fester for 28 years, and I mostly felt sorry for the waste of a life. Mr. Feld heard about Voss before I could tell him, and he called me that same night, sounding 20 years younger. He said he had carried Helen's secret for nearly 3 decades because he believed she wanted it buried with her. Now the man who had caused it had buried himself instead. Your mother would have liked how this ended, Gracie, he told me. Quiet, just like her. Sean was mine to handle, and I handled him the next Sunday. I sat across from him in the same kitchen where we'd eaten Helen's meatballs as kids, and I told him plainly, I loved him. He was my brother, and I would never again cover his debts, his bills, or any emergency built by his own choices. He called me cold. He said family doesn't do math. Family doesn't sell math either, I said. You didn't borrow from me, Sean. You spent me. He had nothing to say to that, so he reached for the old weapon, the joke about my weight, the eye roll. For the first time in my life, it bounced off. Not because it stopped hurting, but because I finally knew my worth wasn't up for his vote. Whether we ever rebuild is his responsibility now. Then came the evening. Everything in this story had been walking toward. Carmine found me after a church supper, drying trays, sleeves pushed up, hair falling down, the least romantic version of me in existence. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and for the first time since I'd met him, Carmine Beloro looked nervous. He said he had something to say, and he wanted to say it without excuses. I could tell you Voss manipulated me, he said. It's true, and it doesn't matter. He built the trap, but I'm the one who walked into it smiling. He chose the moment. I chose to play. No one made me put that money on your tray. That was my pride, and my choice. And I've been more ashamed of that choice than of anything in a life with real competition for the title. Then he asked it, "Can you forgive me?" 4 words from a man who commanded hundreds of people and could command none of the answer. And here is what I told him, because I believe it's the truest thing I know. Yes, I forgive you, but forgiveness and trust are different currencies. The first one I'm handing you, the second one you'll have to earn. He didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He nodded, said, "Then I'll see you around, Grace," and left me to my trays. If you're still with me after all this, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe. Not for me, but because stories like this remind somebody out there that their worth was never up for negotiation. And I'd love to know, would you have forgiven him that night, or made him wait? What happened next wasn't a movie. It was months. Carmine proved himself the slow way, the only way that counts. He never touched my finances, never tried to pay off my debts, my rent, or Sean's latest crater, and I cannot tell you how much respect that took. He respected my work instead. He showed up at community events and stacked chairs like a volunteer instead of presiding like a patron. He remembered Mr. Feld, asked after the knee, every dry day, quietly arranged for the club to fix the cloakroom's broken heater without attaching his name to it. And he learned my language. He learned that my jokes had 2 settings, happy and hiding, and he stopped being fooled by the second one. That one was a shield, he'd say gently. Want to tell me what's behind it? There were stumbles. Once, without thinking, he had his accountant quietly look into my late rent, and when I found out, I did not speak to him for 9 days. He never defended it. He simply showed up at the church kitchen on the 10th morning, tied on an apron, and asked which pot needed stirring. "I confused helping with owning," he said. "It will not happen again." It didn't. Slowly, without noticing the exact day it happened, I stopped expecting affection to vanish the moment I became inconvenient. Trust became friendship. Friendship became companionship. Companionship became something I didn't have a safe word for, so I called it lasagna nights and pretended that was all it was. Helen used to say, "Love isn't a lightning strike, it's a slow oven." She'd have liked him. That's the thought that undid me. I asked him once, over coffee, why he kept coming back when I gave him so little encouragement. He considered it seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything that mattered. "For 49 years, people wanted things from me," he said. "You were the first person who ever wanted nothing." It took me months to understand that nothing was everything. It ended where the honest parts of my life have always happened. The church kitchen, after a Saturday supper, with the last of the volunteers gone, and Mr. Feld heading out with the meal I'd packed him. "Don't stay too late, Gracie," he said, and then he looked at Carmine and smiled at some private memory and left us alone among the cooling trays and the smell of tomato sauce. Carmine was drying pans because the man had decided 2 months earlier that my church needed him more than his Saturday nights did, and somewhere between the soup pot and the dish rack, he stepped close to me. And then he stopped. No request, no bargain, no assumption. He just stood there, close enough, and waited. Waited, I realized, for the one thing money had never once been able to get him. He was waiting for my choice, so I made it. I took his face in my hands, dishwater hands, no apron-off movie moment, just me, Grace Malone, 33, curvy, tired, and completely sure, and I kissed him. The most feared man in South Philadelphia closed his eyes like a man being handed something fragile. When we finally pulled apart, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, very softly, "What do I owe you?" I laughed, and the tears I'd refused those men months ago finally came, but they were mine now, happy ones, and I let them fall. 2 trays of lasagna, I told him, and a lifetime ban on dares. He agreed to both, and he has honored both, though the lasagna debt keeps somehow never quite being paid off. I suspect he lets it roll over on purpose. I've decided to allow it. People who hear this story think it ends with a catering coordinator getting the powerful man. It doesn't. It ends with a kiss nobody asked me to sell. I gave it freely, at my price, which was never money. It was being seen, being chosen, being someone instead of something. And the wildest part? I didn't learn my worth from Carmine's forgiveness request. I learned it from my mother's ghost, standing third from the left in a hallway photograph, reminding me that Malone women had never been for sale. So if you're watching this, and somebody has made you feel like your softness is a discount bin, your age, your body, your bank account, your quiet life, hear me. Dignity isn't something the powerful hand out. It's something you already own before anyone learns your name. Helen knew it. I finally know it. And my prayer these days is different. God, love is difficult. Thank you for not sending me an idiot. At any price.